The problem with being the last two standing is that someone has to knock on the doors. Corporal Deacon Frost pressed his forehead against the cold viewport of the transport shuttle, watching the blue-green sphere of Arcturus Prime disappear behind them. His reflection stared back, hollow eyes, a fresh scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and a face that had aged 10 years in 3 days. Beside him, Thrace clicked her mandibles in what he'd learned to recognize as grief. The Vescari warriors' chittering had been constant since they'd pulled themselves from the rubble of Outpost Gamma, a sound like wind through broken glass that never quite stopped. 6 had gone in, 2 came out. Now they carried the weight of 4 stories that their families deserved to hear. Do you remember when Korvath first joined our unit? Thrace's translator rendered her native clicks into something approximating standard. Her 4 arms folded against her thorax, the lower pair clutching a sealed container that held what remained of their squad mate's personal effects. Deacon nodded, not trusting his voice yet. He remembered everything, every joke, every meal, every moment that led them to that godforsaken patrol on the edge of nowhere. The memory surfaced unbidden. 2 months ago, when Squad Delta had first assembled at the garrison on Arcturus Prime, Sergeant Tom Brennan had been the one to break the ice, dropping his pack on the barracks floor with enough force to rattle every locker in the room. He grinned, the kind of wide, genuine smile that made people trust him instantly. "So we've got bugs, lizards, and rocks walking into a bar," he announced, surveying their new squad mates. "This is either the start of a great joke or the worst assignment in the sector." Thrace had bristled, her mandibles flaring. "The Vescari are not insects." Tom raised his hands in mock surrender. "No offense intended, ma'am. Where I come from, we rib the people we respect." "Then you do not respect many people, Sergeant," came a deep, resonant voice. Korvath stepped forward, his crystalline form refracting the barracks lights into dancing patterns across the walls. The Luminar stood nearly 7 feet tall, his body composed of living mineral that shifted and flowed like slow water frozen mid-splash. "Your humor is as subtle as a fusion grenade." Deacon had snorted, earning him a glare from Tom that held no real heat. The other 2 members rounded out their squad. 6, the Dralathi scout, possessed skin that shifted colors with his mood, currently a curious amber. His species moved with liquid grace, double-jointed limbs, allowing impossible contortions. Then there was Henna, a Queller medic whose 6 eyes could perceive across multiple light spectrums, and whose 3-fingered hands could stabilize wounds that would have killed most beings before they hit the ground. For 3 weeks, they drilled together, learned each other's combat styles, shared rations that ranged from palatable to biohazardous, depending on your species' digestive enzymes. Tom had taught Korvath poker. Thrace had shown Deacon the pressure points on 17 different alien anatomies. 6 had made them all laugh with his impressions of their commanding officer. They'd become more than a unit. They'd become brothers and sisters in everything but blood. The transport shuttle's engines shifted pitch as they entered the approach pattern for New Havana Station. Deacon finally spoke, his voice rough with disuse. "We patrolled the same routes for 38 days. Nothing but boredom and recycled air. Then the one day Tom decides to check the long-range scanner array himself. The syndicate hit us with everything." Thrace finished the thought, her upper hands clenched into fists. 3 ships, 40 raiders. They wanted the deuterium reserves at Gamma. Deacon closed his eyes, but that only made the memories sharper. The alarm had been their first warning, a shrill keening that meant combat stations. Deacon had been cleaning his rifle when Outpost Gamma's emergency beacon pierced the quiet evening routine. Tom was already moving, barking orders as the squad scrambled. "Delta Squad, gear up. Unknown hostiles inbound to Gamma. 15 minutes out." Their dropship had screamed across the barren landscape of Arcturus Prime's southern continent, skimming over rust-colored valleys and jagged hills. 6 had monitored the tactical display, his skin rippling through shades of red and orange, battle colors, reading multiple heat signatures at Gamma's perimeter. "The garrison is returning fire, but they're outnumbered 3-1. Korvath's voice had rumbled through the comm system. "Syndicate pirates. Their attack pattern matches prior raids in this sector. They strike fast, grab resources, and retreat before reinforcements arrive." "Not this time," Tom had said, checking his weapon. "Not on our watch." They'd come in hot, the dropship taking fire before they even touched down. Deacon remembered the impact, the way his teeth rattled as they hit the landing pad. The rear hatch had dropped, and they'd poured out into hell. The syndicate raiders were a motley collection of outcasts and mercenaries, a dozen species unified only by greed and violence. They'd already breached Gamma's outer wall, cutting through defenders with plasma fire and explosive charges. Tom had moved like he was born to combat, his rifle singing death in controlled bursts. Deacon stayed back to cover him while Thrace's four arms wielded weapons with impossible coordination. She dropped 3 raiders in as many seconds, her movements a blur of lethal efficiency. Six had gone high, his chameleonic skin letting him blend with the outpost's damaged infrastructure. He'd called out enemy positions, his shots picking off targets that couldn't even see him coming. Korvath had been their anchor, his crystalline body shrugging off rounds that would have killed anyone else. He'd planted himself at a choke point, turning himself into a living barricade, while Henna worked frantically to stabilize wounded garrison members behind him. For 20 minutes, they'd held. The Syndicate had thrown bodies at them, but Delta Squad had been trained by the best, forged in the crucible of a dozen border skirmishes. They'd started to turn the tide. Then the second wave had arrived. A Syndicate assault carrier had dropped from orbit, bypassing the planetary defense grid through sheer audacity. It disgorged another 30 raiders, these ones wearing powered armor and carrying weapons that made their rifles look like toys. "Fall back," Tom had screamed into the comm. "Get the civilians to the bunker." Deacon had grabbed a wounded garrison tech, hauling her toward cover as plasma bolts turned the air around him into soup. Henna had been beside him, her multiple eyes tracking threats from every angle as she laid down suppressing fire. That's when the building had exploded. Not the whole structure, just the southern corner where Six had taken position. Deacon had watched in horror as his friend was consumed by the blast, his chameleon skin failing in his final moment, leaving him visible as the flames claimed him. "Six is down." Thrace's voice had been raw with rage. She charged the raider who'd fired the rocket, her weapons forgotten, relying on claws and fury. She'd torn through his armor like paper. Tom had rallied them, forming a defensive perimeter around the bunker entrance. The garrison personnel were flooding inside, civilians and support staff scrambling to safety, while Delta Squad bought them seconds with blood. Korvath had been magnificent in those final moments. 3 Syndicate soldiers in powered armor had tried to rush their position, and the Luminar had met them head-on. His fists, dense as any metal, had crumpled armor plating. For a moment, Deacon had thought they might actually make it. Then he'd seen the grenades, 3 of them sailing in perfect arcs toward the bunker entrance where 2 dozen souls huddled in terror. Korvath had seen them too. The Luminar hadn't hesitated. He'd thrown himself over the grenades, his body compressing into a dense sphere. The detonation had been muffled, contained mostly within his crystalline mass. He'd saved everyone in that bunker, but Luminar don't regenerate from that kind of trauma. Korvath had fractured into 1,000 glittering pieces, each one a memory of a friend who'd chosen sacrifice. Regroup at the secondary position. Tom had been bleeding from a dozen wounds, but still standing, still commanding. Henna had moved to treat him, but he'd waved her off. "Get the others. I'll cover." Deacon had known, in that instant, what Tom was planning. He'd grabbed his sergeant's arm, shaking his head. Tom had just smiled that same grin from the barracks. "Someone's got to tell my mom I went out swinging. Make sure she knows I saved the good people. That's all that matters." Then he'd shoved Deacon toward the bunker, raised his rifle, and started singing. Actually singing, some old Terran war song about mountains and brave men. His voice had carried over the gunfire, defiant and unbreakable. Tom Brennan had held that corridor for 5 minutes. 5 minutes that felt like hours. He'd let Deacon, Thrace, and Henna get the civilians sealed in the bunker. He'd let reinforcements from Outpost Alpha get into position. And when his rifle finally clicked empty, when the Syndicate finally overwhelmed his position, Tom had triggered every grenade he carried. The explosion had collapsed the corridor, sealing off the Syndicate's primary approach. It had also ensured no one would find enough of Sergeant Tom Brennan to fill a shoebox. Henna had been working on a wounded garrison pilot, her 3-fingered hands moving with their usual precise efficiency despite the chaos around them. Deacon had noticed she was moving slower than usual, her 6 eyes not tracking threats the way they normally did. "Henna, you good?" he'd called over. "Fine. This one needs me more." Her translator had rendered the words without the usual crispness. It wasn't until the pilot was stable and Henna tried to stand that Deacon saw it. Dark fluid, her blood had been pooling beneath her the entire time. A round had punched clean through what passed for her torso, severing organs no medkit could repair. No, Deacon had rushed to her, catching her as she collapsed. Why didn't you say anything? What can I do? Her 6 eyes had focused on him, already starting to dim. Nothing. Her mandibles trembled, but she managed what he'd learned was a Queller smile. Healing oath comes first. Always first. Henna, don't. But even as he said it, Deacon knew there was nothing he could do. Her species biology was too different, the damage too severe. She'd reached up with one shaking hand, touching his face. Tell my clutchmates I honored the healing oath. Tell them I saved who I could. Then her eyes had dimmed one by one, like stars going out, and Deacon had been left holding a friend who'd chosen a stranger's life over her own chance at survival. Then she'd gone, and Deacon and Thrace had been alone with 37 terrified survivors and the weight of 4 deaths between them. Reinforcements from Outpost Alpha had arrived 30 minutes later, their dropships touching down in a perimeter secured by Tom's final stand. The Syndicate forces had retreated once they realized the entire sector was converging on their position, abandoning their prize and leaving behind wreckage and bodies. Medics had flooded the bunker, triaging the wounded, while Deacon and Thrace had stood like statues among the organized chaos, unable to process that they were the only 2 left of Delta Squad. The evacuation had been a blur of medical checks and debriefings, officers asking questions Deacon barely remembered answering. Command had given them 72 hours to recover before their next assignment came through, not another patrol, but something harder. Someone had to notify the families, someone who'd been there, someone who could tell them the truth, which led them to where they were now. The shuttle touched down with barely a bump. Deacon forced himself to stand, his body protesting every movement. Thrace rose beside him, her mandibles still clicking that mournful rhythm. First stop is New Havana, Deacon said quietly. Tom's mother lives there, works at the shipyard. Then we go to the Vescari colony ship in the Pearl Cluster, Thrace added. Henna's clutchmates must know she died with honor, Deacon nodded. Corvath's formation, his family, they're on Luminar Prime. We'll need to take the long route through the spine. And Six's pod group lives on Drala, 3 months journey. 3 months. Deacon picked up the case with Six's effects, his chameleonic weave cloak now permanently fixed to a dull grey, the color of death. They walked down the shuttle ramp together into the organized chaos of the spaceport. No one noticed 2 soldiers among thousands. No one saw the grief they carried. Tom's mother lived in a small apartment overlooking the shipyard's dry docks. She answered the door with flour on her hands and concern in her eyes. Concern that turned to understanding when she saw their faces, their uniforms, the case Deacon held. She'd let them in, made them sit, listened as Deacon told her how her son had saved 37 lives, how he'd died singing, how his last thoughts had been making sure someone would tell her he'd done good. She'd cried, of course, but she'd also smiled through her tears. That's my Tommy, always putting everyone else first, always smiling. She'd gripped Deacon's hand with surprising strength. Thank you for bringing him home, even if it's just the story. Thank you for being there. The Vescari colony ship was a world unto itself, a hollowed asteroid that housed 10,000 souls. Henna's clutchmates had gathered in a meditation chamber, their mandibles clicking in synchronized grief as Thrace recounted their sister's final act of healing. She honored us all, the eldest had said, her translator crackling with emotion. The Queller remember. We will tell her story to every generation. Her sacrifice will not fade. Corvath's formation on Luminar Prime had been something else entirely. The crystalline beings didn't weep, couldn't weep, but they dimmed their inner light in mourning. Corvath's shard mother had accepted the fragments they'd recovered, pieces of her child that would be incorporated into the family structure, a literal part of them forever. He became what we all aspire to be, she'd resonated, her voice like wind chimes. A shield for the innocent. We grieve, but we are proud. The journey to Drala was the longest. 3 months gave Deacon and Thrace too much time to remember, too much time to replay the moments they could have changed. But it also gave them time to heal, to share stories of their fallen, to realize that grief shared was somehow lighter. Six's pod group met them at the landing platform, their skin rippling through a rainbow of emotions. Deacon told them how their son had been their eyes, how his humor had kept morale up during the darkest watches, how he died ensuring they knew where the threat was coming from. One of Six's pod brothers had approached Deacon after the telling, his skin settling into a deep, respectful blue. You carry our grief with you. That is the mark of true family. We thank you not just for the telling, but for standing beside him. 6 months after Arcturus Prime, Deacon and Thrace stood together on the memorial field at Galactic Defense Force headquarters. A monument rose before them, black stone etched with names, thousands of names. And there, among the thousands, 4 new ones joined the roll of honor. Sergeant Thomas Brennan, Specialist Henna Qualseth, Specialist Corvath 12 Formation, Specialist 6 Drivala. We could have stayed quiet, Thrace said, her mandibles finally still. Filed reports. Let the families receive official notifications. Deacon shook his head. They deserved more than a form letter. They deserved to know their people were heroes, that they saved lives, that they mattered. Do you think we honored them properly? I think, Deacon paused, touching the dog tags that hung around his neck. Tom's tags worn alongside his own. I think we did the only thing that mattered. We told the truth. We shared the burden. That's what family does. Thrace's mandibles spread in what Deacon had learned was a Veskari smile. Family, yes. We were family. She reached out with one of her 4 hands, and Deacon gripped it. We are family. They stood there in silence, 2 survivors among the names of the fallen, carrying forward the stories of those who'd paid the final price. The weight of dog tags, the weight of promises kept, the weight of brothers and sisters who'd become something more than their species, more than their differences. They'd become what all sentient beings could aspire to be, souls who stood together when it mattered most. And that, Deacon realized, was the story worth telling, not just of death, but of the bonds that transcended it, not just of sacrifice, but of the love that made sacrifice meaningful. The universe was vast and cold and often cruel, but it was also filled with moments like these, where different worlds, different beings, different hearts found common ground in the truths that mattered most. Courage, honor, sacrifice, love. The words carved into the memorial's base said it simply. They stood together. They fell together. They are remembered forever. Deacon and Thrace saluted. And somewhere, in whatever lay beyond, 4 voices sang together in harmony. The weight of dog tags was heavy, but it was a weight worth carrying, always. 18 months after Arcturus Prime, Deacon walked into the briefing room at Firebase Sentinel and stopped dead in his tracks. Thrace stood at the front of the room, her 4 arms crossed in a posture he'd learned meant she was nervous, but hiding it well. Behind her, 4 other figures waited, species Deacon absolutely recognized. Surprise, Thrace clicked, her mandibles spreading in that Veskari smile. Command approved my request. We're building something new. Deacon set his gear down slowly, his eyes moving across the assembled team. A young Dralathi with skin that shifted to an excited yellow. A Luminar whose crystalline structure caught the overhead lights. A Queller medic whose 6 eyes tracked him with cautious curiosity. And a human female who just smiled. Squad Delta, Thrace continued, her voice steady despite the weight those words carried. Reborn. Not to replace who we lost, but to honor them, to keep their legacy alive. The Dralathi stepped forward, extending a 3-fingered hand. Scout Specialist Cree, I've read the reports from Gamma. What you both did, getting those families their stories, it meant something. My pod brother served with 6 once. He told me if I ever got the chance to serve with Delta, I should take it. The human female specialist Casey Lane approached. I heard you guys are a solid team. I served with Tom a few years back. I figured I could do him proud by linking up with you. The Luminar's voice resonated like distant thunder. Tactical Specialist Ven 8 Formation, Corvath's shard cousin. My formation asked me to carry forward his honor. I accepted. The Queller approached last, her movements graceful despite obvious nervousness. Field Medic Specialist Tessa Quinvala. Henna trained me during my first deployment. She saved my life twice. Her mandibles trembled slightly. I want to honor her oath the way she did, by being there when it matters. Deacon looked at each of them, then back to Thrace. His throat tightened, but this time it wasn't from grief. You did this. We did this, Thrace corrected. Command gave me the option to build a new squad after my promotion. I told them yes under one condition, you as my second. They agreed. She moved closer, lowering her voice. We can't bring them back, Deacon, but we can make sure what they stood for continues. We can make sure their sacrifice meant something beyond one day on one planet. Deacon thought about Tom's grin, Corvath's quiet strength, Henna's dedication. Six's humor. He thought about the promises made at grave sites and memorial stones. He thought about the tags worn close to his heart. Then he thought about moving forward, about the difference between forgetting and honoring. When do we start? He asked. Thrace's mandibles clicked in what he now recognized as relief. Tomorrow, we've got a patrol, 3 outposts on the frontier. Deacon laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months. Of course we do. And with that, Delta Squad would patrol again. They would face whatever came. And they would face it together, always together. That was the promise. That was the legacy. And that was enough.